Jesus' parables. Today's gospel lesson is the hardest to understand. Robert Capon, the guru of parables, says that it spooks more interpreters and more false starts than any other parable. And even the best scholar on Luke, Joseph Fitzmyer, says that the parable is puzzling. So if this parable is troublesome and puzzling to the big brains, what chance do I have of understanding it? Not much. So let us dive in where scholars fear to tread, shall we? First, there was this rich man who had a manager. We are told the Greek for manager is oikonomos. We got our word economy from it. Oikos means house, and nomos means law. In other words, this was the guy who laid down the law for the household manager. In those days, an oikonomos was especially trained and tested to supervise the estate, farm, or home. And in Roman times, these managers were trained and tested to see if they possessed competence, fidelity, and goodwill on behalf of their bosses. Think of this guy as the modern equivalent of a business manager, CPA, MBA, financial advisor kind of person rolled up into one. So charges were brought to the rich man that the oikonomos was squandering the property. Notice that it doesn't say that this manager was embezzling the assets for himself. It says that he was squandering them. He might have just been inept or stupid or dishonest. Any one of those is possible. The Bible doesn't say. So even though this parable is commonly known as the dishonest steward, that title really might not be right. It might not fit the situation at all. You could just as easily have described him as the inept manager or the stupid steward instead. So the boss hears through the grapevine that his business manager is squandering his assets and he fires him. The boss tells the manager to prepare an account. In other words, an inventory of the boss's possessions and the listing of the debtors and how much they owe the boss. It's audit time, not your usual annual audit, but your detailed audit after financial mismanagement, sometimes known as a forensic audit if they expect dishonesty. So the manager says to himself, what am I going to do now? I've lost my job and I'm too weak to do the digging and nobody else is going to hire me to be a business manager and I'm too proud to beg. It reminds me of the old Southern saying that you were too poor to paint and too proud to whitewash. That it's a saying that, I'm between a rock and a hard place right now. So he decides what he's going to do. First, in order to understand this parable, we have to understand what the manager's job description was. In those days, remember that communications took months to complete. In fact, there was no post office, there was no UPS, there was no FedEx, obviously no telegraph or telephone, no fax, no email, no texting. So to get a message to someone, the only way to do it in those days was to hire a human to go by foot and carry it sometimes to long distances or unknown places. Because of this, managers or stewards were given extraordinary power in that day. The manager was able to enter into contracts, to make loans in the boss's name, and to bind the boss into legal obligations. In other words, the oikonomos was like somebody who held a power of attorney for the boss, who was completely out of touch and might show up anytime or might not show up for a long time. And the customary thing to do in those days was to lend out the boss's property with the commission or interest added to the principal amount on the face of the note. Imagine that instead of signing a mortgage note for $100,000 with interest at 6% for 15 years, instead you signed a note that included the interest on the face of the note, and it said $180,000 in 6 years or 15 years. And also remember, in those days, there was no Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, no guarantee, no Fed, no guarantee that an invading army would not come along and knock over the banks and take all the money out, and the bank would go belly up and mess everything up. So interest rates in those days ran as high as 50% a year. Imagine trying to pay off a loan with 50% interest. So if you borrowed $100,000 for a year in those days, you'd sign a note for $150,000 to be paid in a year. And that's how the manager got paid. The more money he made for the boss, the more money he made for himself. The notes only mentioned the total amount of all the payments, the principal plus the interest. To give you an example, the ancient historian Josephus notes that when the Emperor Herod Agrippa borrowed money, he wrote a note for 20,000 drachmas, even though he only received 17,500 drachmas in cash. That's a 14.3% interest rate, according to my figures. And that was the interest rate that the Emperor of Rome got. Imagine what the ordinary poor Joe Schmo out on the street would get. It would be nothing like the Emperor of Rome. And the same thing was true when people borrowed food or other objects, when they were doing bartering instead of money. Except when the loan was for food or goods, the interest rate was exceptionally high. Historical documents record 50% interest rate on a loan of wheat, for example. Now back to the parable. So the inept or stupid steward calls the debtors into the first. He says, "How much do you owe my master?" And the man answers, 100 jugs of olive oil. A jug was about 9 gallons of oil. So the debt was about 900 gallons of olive oil, a considerable amount, obviously worth $30,000 to $60,000 wholesale, according to Google's AI search engine this week. So the manager says, "Take your bill and make it half." In other words, the manager, knowing that he was already fired and that he would never see his commission when collected, wiped out his commission in order to make a friend in the man who owed the debt. And the manager asked the second one, "How much do you owe?" And the answer was 100 measures of wheat. That translates in modern times to about 85 bushels of wheat. The manager says, "Make it 60 bushels instead of 85, about $300 instead of $425, or about a 30% discount instead of 50% discount." And so the manager wipes out his commission and the owner's profit, knowing that he'd already lost his job right now and would never see the commission later on when the note came due. And the master commends the squandering steward because he had been shrewd. In other words, it's not the dishonesty that's being commended that the master praises, but rather the manager's cleverness in making use of whatever power he still had at his command, even when he knows he's in trouble. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. In other words, the people who serve wealth can teach the people who serve God something about cleverness and eagerness and how they leverage their wealth. In the same way, children of light can leverage our faith for the gain of God's kingdom. And we should use whatever powers and abilities we might have to build up God's kingdom by making friends in this life as urgently and desperately as the manager used what power and ability he still had to save his own bacon. For if we are faithful with tiny things that we have control over, in other words, if we're faithful with the physical things of which we are the stewards in this life, we'll receive bigger things in the life of the world to come, we're told. The point is this: we're like the manager. Oh, we may not be dishonest or inept or terrible, but God has given us each the power and authority over things that really belong to God. Everything we claim to own or have possession of, houses, land, cars, money, the environment we share with water and air, our fellow creatures, both domesticated and wild, our planet Earth, this fragile home, even our relationships with spouses, children, parents, and friends, even our talents and abilities and intellect, our minds and bodies, none of these things are completely under our control. And every one of those things really belongs to the God who entrusted them to us to take care of. And we can act with competence and fidelity and goodwill towards the boss, that's God, or we can squander God's property and pretend like we really own it. We have the choice to choose what we trust in. Will we trust in wealth or accumulation or prosperity or money and power? Or will we use everything at our command, our minds and bodies, time, talent, treasures, to faithfully serve the one who really owns them all? Now, I'm not talking about a church pledge, although that'll be coming up in a month or two. I'm talking about the stewardship of our lives, the fundamental decision of who we are and who we belong to. And we know that the really important one in whom to put our trust is God. Even our money says it. You know, pull that dollar bill out of your pocket and it will tell you, in God we trust. There's a story about the great Anglican priest, John Wesley. The Methodist thinks he's theirs, but he's actually ours, you know. John Wesley grew up in poverty. He saw his father, who was also an Anglican priest, in one of England's lowest paying churches, marched off into debtor's prison. Over time, John Wesley accepted a more lucrative position, a teacher at Oxford University, and his salary increased dramatically. At first, we're told Wesley made about 30 pounds a year, which was enough for a single man to live pretty well on. Of that, he spent 26 pounds on himself and gave 4 away. Over the years, his income increased, first to 60, then 90, then 120, and eventually, towards the end of his life, he made over 1,000 pounds a year, which was a lot of money in those days. At the end of his life, the story goes, he made that 1,000 pounds a year, and still he only spent 26 pounds on himself. And he gave away the other 974 pounds. And he died broke because of his generosity. I can't tell you how much I admire that. And I can't tell you also how bad I am at imitating that. You know, I'm the worst. Whenever I've made more money, I spend more money. You know how it goes. Better car, nicer house, better clothes, although they still come from Walmart. I can't tell you how good John Wesley was at that and how bad I am. In that way, I've been as inept as the manager in the parable. So I invite myself, as well as each one of us, to consider, how do we care for the resources that are entrusted into our care? Whether we pretend as though they are ours, or whether we realize that they're God's and we're just the managers. And realizing that, I invite ourselves to ask ourselves, what kind of manager am I? Am I a good and faithful one? Or do I squander God's assets? And you know, Jesus always gives a zinger at the end of each of these passages every week that he gives us. So I invite us especially to remember the zinger that he tosses in at the end of our lesson. You cannot serve God and wealth at the same time. In other places, he tells us we can't serve two masters. Will we be like God and love people and use things? Or will we be like the world tells us to be and love things and use people? You know, it's really each one of our decisions. I can't make it for you. You can't make it for me. And guess what? I think that's what happens when the book closes on our lives. That's what we're going to be judged about. Do we love people and use things, or have we loved things and used people? So, if you want to build up your anxiety, tuck that in the back of your mind and consider it as the week goes by. Amen.